Hi, everyone. Welcome to the next normal session on sustainability. Our session today is the latest in a 20-part webinar series called Business Resilience in All Times. Our goal here is to provide a Silicon Valley perspective on changes we expect in a digitally accelerated post-COVID world. Before I get started, I just want to first say a little bit about Orange Silicon Valley. So Orange Silicon Valley is the Bay Area presence of Orange. Orange, for those of you that don't know, is one of the leading telecommunications operators in the world. We serve 264 million customers across 28 countries. We've been here in Silicon Valley for 20 years, and we have around 45 engineers and business analysts that cover 17 different focal topic areas. So today we're going to be talking about sustainability. I'm very pleased to be joined by Elizabeth Wilmot, who's Carbon Program Manager at Microsoft, as well as Diego Saez-Gil, who's CEO of the startup Pachama. And I'd also like to introduce my colleague, Will Barkas, principal here at Orange Silicon Valley. He's going to help us out with the Q&A throughout the session. And so I just want to say that we really encourage everyone to enter questions, and you can do this two ways. One of them is by entering them publicly in the chat area on the right side of your screen, or you can ask them privately in the questions area. So let's go ahead and get started. So I'll kick things off by giving a 15-minute or so overview of how COVID has impacted sustainability from my perspective. And this includes talking about some of the transient impacts, the permanent shifts, the response from the government sector and the corporate sector, and then a really brief overview, a flyover of kind of the impacts on certain core industries that impact sustainability. And then I'll finish with a note on inequality and climate. And then we'll switch to a fireside chat with Elizabeth and Diego. Followed by some time at the end for Q&A to answer the questions that you've put into the chat window or the questions tab. So to start with transient impacts. So as many of you may know, COVID has caused a drop in carbon emissions globally, but you may not realize that it's actually the largest drop in carbon emissions in recorded human history. So it's really striking. It's more than we saw at any other time over the past century during any of the recessions, more than during World War II. But the real question is, how lasting are these impacts? And unfortunately, there's likely no silver lining in this macro drop in global carbon emissions. So if you look at the major economies of the world, you see that from January to June, many of them are rebounding very quickly. And in fact, China has already returned to pre-COVID emissions levels. And if you look historically, none of those previous recessions really resulted in a lasting impact. After several years, emissions returned to their previous pre-recession levels. So we have to look a little deeper to try and identify some of the long-term impacts of this pandemic. So two of these that I think are particularly important is the shift to remote work or work from home. And the second is the major decline in business air travel. So with work from home still around the world, and especially in the US, office buildings are largely closed. And this has caused and spurred a number of technology companies as well as other employers to announce that they're going to shift more permanently to remote work. So Twitter has announced this, Square has announced it, Facebook and others. And what this means is that almost 50% of companies are actually planning to reduce their physical office footprint. So for sustainability, this means that there's actually a positive impact of this remote work. So working from home is much more energy efficient than commuting to an office. And this is primarily due to savings in fuel that's burned for transportation. So if you look at this figure, this is a study that compared office workers that commute versus remote office workers. And there is an uptick in energy use for heating and cooling households because you have all these individual households being heated or cooled where people are working remotely as opposed to a centralized office building. But that uptick is more than offset by gains in reduced fuel use. And it's true not only in the US where you have very long commuter miles, but it's also true in China and EU. And so what this could mean going forward is that home energy retrofits and smart energy management could take on new importance. And corporations can actually more easily meet their climate targets by shifting entirely or partly to a remote workforce. The other big shift that I've seen is that business travel has declined enormously. So business travel was very important to airlines. It was actually 60 to 70% of airline sales pre-COVID. And unfortunately, half of Fortune 500 CEOs say that business travel is likely to never return to pre-COVID levels. And a sign of this is Zoom's $70 billion valuation now exceeds that of the 6 largest airlines in the US combined. And for sustainability, this is interesting because it could mean a quick climate win for many companies. Global carbon emissions from airlines are very significant. It's 2.5% of the total. And they're very difficult to deal with through any other means. You largely just have to offset them currently. This is likely to be pretty important going forward because COVID has made video conferencing much more acceptable. And so that I think makes it much easier to eliminate business travel that will now be seen as unnecessary. So reducing or eliminating business air travel reduces costs and allows for companies potentially to meet much more aggressive climate targets. This is particularly true for technology companies or consulting firms, which for those types of companies, air travel is a very large proportion of their carbon emissions, sometimes the largest proportion. And in addition, many business conferences that seek to be more sustainable are likely to switch to partial or complete virtual options, just because that's a way to hold a very green conference, and I think it'll become more acceptable going forward. So now I want to talk a little bit about the government response, which admittedly has been quite limited so far. And this is likely because governments are really focused on managing the public health crisis at hand, and they likely don't have much bandwidth right now for sustainability considerations. However, I just want to note a few things. So at the national scale in the US, unlike in Europe, the US has not yet passed any kind of green stimulus bill, and nothing's really in the pipeline yet. At the state level, some states have reduced industry pressure. So this is true in California, where the state has reduced its mandate for Lyft and Uber. Previously, they had required these companies to have 60% of the vehicles in their fleet be electric. Now that's been reduced to 40% to account for the decline in ride-sharing use because of COVID. At the local scale, I think local governments are really in fiscal crisis, and for them to sustain their sustainability programs going forward, I think it's likely that those programs will begin to be tied more tightly to economic recovery efforts. And then at the international scale, the UN reset their emission offset thresholds just this month, or last month, for airlines at 2019 levels. So many airlines will not exceed these in 2020 because they're flying so much less than they did last year. So that means the airlines will likely be offsetting less than they would have otherwise. So the corporate response, this has been much more encouraging and really continues some of the momentum that we saw last fall especially. So big companies are continuing to make historic commitments. This is true especially for Amazon with their Climate Pledge Fund, Microsoft, which is tackling their carbon emissions in their supply chain, Apple's doing the same. Unilever is now labeling all of their products with a carbon footprint label. Ford has committed to go net zero by 2050, and Stripe has made their first carbon negative investments. And in addition to those things, many of these companies are working together now in ways that they haven't in the past. So there's a new initiative launched several weeks ago called Transform to Net Zero, where many of these companies will be working together to share insights and approaches on how to reach net zero climate targets more quickly. And if you look at surveys of executives, many see, in fact, a positive influence of COVID on sustainability efforts, although there is a minority that sees a negative impact, and that could be coming from the industries that were hardest hit because of the shutdowns. So what might explain these trends? So you might think that companies would really just refocus on their bottom lines and pull away from all of their sustainability efforts during the crisis. And actually that hasn't happened. And one reason could be that investors appear to continue to be rewarding firms with strong environmental and climate strategies, even during a bear market. So if you look just in March and April when stocks were declining fast, the industry adjusted crisis returns for firms that had very high environmental scores were much better. So investors are continuing to sort of double down on sustainability during the crisis. And then I just want to note a few trends that I think were definitely happening pre-COVID, and I see no reason to think that they should slow down. They may accelerate to the extent that there's a kind of general digitalization effort by corporations post-COVID, and one of these is on sustainability accounting. And so corporations can only address sustainability if they can measure their impacts and digitize the data. And here, the supply chain currently I see as being a major focus of these efforts. And this is true for these recent commitments that we've seen from Microsoft, Apple, Unilever, Cargill, and others. And there are incumbents that are offering services for this market, but there's also a whole range of interesting startups that are really helping companies access the data they need on sustainability, both in terms of carbon and a range of other metrics. And then once companies have these enhanced data streams, I think there's going to be increasing efforts at making the corporate mitigation strategies higher quality and more impactful. And so there's two ways that I see this happening. One of them is with carbon offsets. And I think these will continue to become more transparent, science-based, and verified by technology. So for those of you that don't work on offsets, basically you can think of them, for example, if you travel by plane, you might pay to match an equivalent area of forest to be restored or preserved to match the amount of carbon that you burned on your flight. Carbon capture technology, I think, will also receive greater attention going forward as offsets continue to become the baseline that everyone is doing. And so carbon capture, this is basically sucking carbon out of the atmosphere and locking it away in the earth or in industrial products. So for example, in cement. And now I just want to give a really brief flyover of 4 key industries to sustainability that I think have been impacted significantly by COVID. The first is clean energy, and unfortunately here it's a setback. So the B2B sector with clean energy has been relatively stable. Unfortunately, the consumer sector has seen dramatically reduced sales with respect to home solar systems and electric vehicles. And so it may take some time for this sector to recover, and it may need government support to do so. The oil and gas sector, which saw extremely low oil prices over the past few months, they're likely to hasten their investment in clean energy. And you've already seen some movement just in the past few weeks by Shell and BP in that direction. For food and agriculture, in the US in particular, the meat supply was heavily disrupted by COVID. And going forward, that seems to have pushed consumers and retailers towards alternative protein sources. So if you take Impossible Foods as an example and the Impossible Burger, Since April, they've gone from being in 1,000 retail locations to over 5,000, and that shows no sign of slowing down. So this could really change the landscape as companies seek to address supply chain issues by switching to products that shorten those supply chains. And then with logistics, what we've seen during COVID is an incredible boost in the volume really of e-commerce. So sure, there was e-commerce before COVID, but now you have Amazon as well as Walmart, as well as a whole host of other players that are delivering products to consumer doorsteps. And I think you'll see that carbon efficiency of e-commerce really comes under scrutiny, and you'll see consumers wanting green or low carbon shipping options for packages that are delivered to their homes. And then lastly, I just want to finish with a note on inequality and climate. So climate change really at its core is an issue of inequality. And this is interesting because prior to COVID, you had the climate strike last fall, which involved 6 million people globally. It was the largest in history. And then over the past few months, arguably as a result of COVID, you've had 15 to 26 million people participate in the US in the Black Lives Matter movement. That's potentially the largest demonstration in US history as well. And going forward, I think it will be really interesting to see how these two movements might come together. And this is because the poorest communities experience the greatest impacts of climate change, yet they have the least resources to mitigate and adapt to those impacts. So think about coastal communities that don't have the resources to build a seawall, for example. And these movements may reinforce each other going forward. And you're seeing some signs of this in leaders of these movements and what they're saying. So for example, Greta Thunberg in July said that we cannot keep sweeping these things under the carpet, these injustices. And then Emily Atkin, who's a leading climate journalist in the US, said that racial justice is climate justice. That means that police reform is climate policy. So I think this is just something to watch going forward. And you may see the climate movement get a boost, as well as the Black Lives Matter movement get a boost by integrating the issues that these two movements are focused on. So now I'd like to go ahead and switch to a fireside chat with our two guests. And I'll just first introduce both of them. So Elizabeth Wilmot leads Microsoft's carbon program. This includes fulfillment of the company's public commitment to be carbon negative by 2030, remove its historical emissions by 2050, expand their carbon fee, and cut their supply chain emissions. Diego Saez-Gil is CEO of Pachama. Pachama is building a technology-verified marketplace for forest carbon offsets. Diego previously founded two successful tech startups, BlueSmart and WeHostels, and he's twice been selected by Y Combinator. So I'm really pleased to be joined by both of them. And I guess just to kick things off, maybe we could start with you, Liz, and could you tell us just a bit about your current role at Microsoft? And then I know you're working with Diego already, so could you talk a bit about that as well?
Happy to, and it's such a pleasure to be with all of you today. So thanks to George and the Orange team for this invitation. I am the Carbon Program Manager at Microsoft, which means that I sit on the Global Environmental Sustainability team, reporting into our Chief Environmental Officer. And in that context, I'm responsible for making sure that the company meets its carbon negative commitment that we set in January. And that essentially means that we are going to cut our carbon in half across our value chain and then remove the rest, and then go ahead and actually remove the equivalent of our historical emissions by 2050. So it's a big remit, but there's a huge team, in fact, at the company that I have the privilege of being a part of that's working on this. And also in that context, I've had the pleasure of making a pilot purchase from Pachama of carbon project credits, and happy to get into that a little more as the conversation wears on.
That's a good transition over to you, Diego. Do you want to say a little bit about Pachama before we go any further?
For sure. Yes, as you, and thank you so much for the invite. It's a pleasure to be here with you guys. As you very well mentioned, we are a technology startup here in Silicon Valley, working to bridge or to bring all the technology advancements that Silicon Valley has developed, harnessing satellite imagery, remote sensing in general, and artificial intelligence to bring more transparency, more trust, more integrity to the world of carbon offsets. And in particularly, we decided to focus on nature-based solutions, reforestation and forest conservation, which we believe has an enormous potential to remove carbon from the atmosphere and provide other benefits. So we're using these technologies to validate and monitor existing projects, people that have been doing great jobs for many years, and then bring these projects to market, and eventually in the future help originate new projects. If we are going to solve climate change, we need thousands of more projects starting reforestation and conservation, and that's the bridge that we're trying to build. And yeah, super excited to be working with Microsoft. We continue to be super inspired by the leadership that Microsoft is showing, and we're seeing how many other companies are looking up at Microsoft and trying to follow these steps.
Great. Well, so I want to ask you more about both what Microsoft's doing and Pachama, but first, just to kind of continue the thread that I started on COVID and the impacts, maybe Diego, we could stay with you for a minute. From your vantage point, how have you observed COVID impacting sustainability, either for Pachama or in the space generally?
Yeah, I mean, definitely when the crisis kind of like became super clear, we saw a lot of companies slowing down or stopping altogether their efforts and, you know, waiting and seeing how this new world was going to look like. But in more recent weeks, we saw a coming back of companies re-engaging strongly and standing by their commitments, and even some companies preparing to make new pledges that would show their commitment, as you were very well saying on your presentation. We also saw on the before COVID, we were seeing a super exciting momentum on Silicon Valley, on venture capital, looking to invest on climate tech. And similarly, when COVID exploded, you know, everything went silent for a little bit. But now we're seeing again very strong interest from investors on investing in technologies to unlock climate solutions. And in general, you know, the last 3 weeks, I spent, you know, half of my day talking to corporate departments focused on sustainability, and I'm seeing or I'm hearing conversations over and over about how post-COVID climate change is going to be the issue that all corporations are going to be focusing on, because everything is interrelated. I think that if COVID made something super clear is the importance of resilience, how interconnected global systems are, and how corporate action is so important in front of this big crisis.
Right. So the corporations are seeing a huge opportunity for risk mitigation, you know, combined with addressing climate issues. That's
yeah. In a way, you know, you could say that sustainability and resilience are faces of the same coin, and more sustainable companies are going to be more resilient to any type of global shock. And the next one after the pandemic is going to be the effects of climate change. So yeah, that's what I think forward-looking corporate leaders are seeing.
Liz, the same question to you from Microsoft's perspective, or just in the space generally. What have you observed?
Yeah, well, it's a great question, one that we think about a lot. It's in Microsoft's DNA to be guided by the science and by the data of what's going on in the world and by the reality of what's going on in the world. And so for us, we look at what the climate scientists say and what the carbon experts say on what we need to do to avoid catastrophic climate change. And we've seen in a really interesting combination of articles over the past couple months. We've seen the International Energy Agency say that we'll likely see an 8% drop of greenhouse gas emissions in 2020. But then that's in context of a really, really steep climb of greenhouse gas emissions in the past 50 to 100 years. So if you take a look, and I'm happy to share this with George to share with the group afterwards, but the Washington Post had a really interesting graphic from the Global Carbon Project a couple months ago, just showing the huge steep climb that we've been on in the past year with the milestones of different global crises. And to us, we just see that not only do we need to sustain that 8% drop that the IEA noted, but we need to drop another 8% every year until 2030 to make the 1.5 degree threshold that climate scientists say is needed for avoidance of the worst harms. And so for us, kind of situating, I know you're asking about COVID, and I will come back to that, but I just want to situate that in what this global crisis, what this global pause has sort of resulted in, and then what do we need to do beyond that. And on a human level, probably because we haven't had to commute to work, haven't had to spend precious time on the road. Although we do love seeing each other as humans in person, we haven't had to do that. We've had some time additional time reclaimed. Our team has been just beyond motivated to keep the productivity really high and maybe even double it, in the sense that we issued our announcement in January, and then we actually just issued a progress update a couple weeks ago, which includes our involvement in the Transform to Net Zero Coalition that you mentioned, George, a supplier code of conduct that we rolled out, requiring our suppliers to not only report their greenhouse gas emissions, but also make reductions in line with our goals. And then we issued a carbon removal RFP that I've been managing just a couple weeks ago. So, and that's not to say that Microsoft is doing it all right, because we're not, but and we won't. We'll learn and grow over time. But I think that that's just one indication of a corporation that's really actually using this moment to double down on sustainability.
Mm-hmm. I mean, that's all very exciting. So I guess. Well, my next question was going to be for you again about, your the carbon negative announcement in particular. And actually, I do want to ask about that, just because I think not everyone in the audience may appreciate how significant that is. Can you just outline why why a carbon negative announcement, and how you see that? Do you see that as something that you hope others are going to all kind of eventually follow and make that a baseline commitment?
For sure, yes, we do, and we hope that it will spread. We set the goal last winter, and we worked hard in the months leading up to our January announcement to really think about what's the actual carbon math that we need as a planet, and then how do we translate that carbon math into what a corporation like us should do. We are in a fortunate position to be able to afford to do this. So we think because we can afford to do so, we should do so. That's something that our president was very explicit about in announcing this. And so for us, it's really a question of how do we start to do the early homework on some of these topics. Not that we're the first, but we're among the first. How do we do the early homework on this topic, and then share that homework with our partners, customers, peers, anyone who will, who's in a position to be able to make change in this way. And so for us, it's really the clearest way that that's shown up is the Transform to Net Zero Coalition, which you had shared previously, which is intended to define what net zero means. And so again, for us, we're going beyond net zero to go carbon negative, but let's just start with what net zero means, because I think what we've seen in the past, and even in the past incarnation of our prior carbon neutral goal, was that carbon neutral claim got watered down and got changed, and people had different perspectives on what that meant. And so we don't want to make that mistake again. We think it's just really, maybe it's because we're geeky tech folks, but we want to make sure that the math is solid and that we all have an agreed upon math to work against, because we just really don't have the time to sort of mess around with, dissent or sort of, really a diversity of methodologies for getting there.
Right. Yeah. That makes a lot of sense. I mean, it can be a challenge even if you follow all the announcements. You really have to look closely to understand exactly what every company has committed to when they say net zero. Just over the past few years. So yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Are you also looking at your customers and their impact? So, I mean, is that part of the carbon negative commitment as well? Because I saw several weeks ago you've released a cloud emissions calculation tool. Does that fit into the broader strategy?
Definitely. As I think most corporate sustainability teams know, if they've done some work on carbon accounting, there are three, according to greenhouse gas protocol, according to carbon accounting standards, there are three scopes for greenhouse gas emissions. Scope 1 is direct emissions, such as burning natural gas in a kitchen on a campus. Scope 2 is electricity related emissions, where we buy electricity. We don't actually have a coal plant or a natural gas plant on the site, but we buy energy. We take that into account. And then scope 3 pertains to everything upstream, everything downstream of our operations. So everything upstream is, for example, our manufacturing of our products like Surfaces and Xboxes, and then everything downstream is the use of our products. So when a Surface or an Xbox plugs into a wall, we count the electricity consumption associated with that. And so when we think about our customers in general, of course, with the greenhouse gas protocol, there's a lot of discretion, and corporations have frankly, a lot of ambiguity that we hope to reduce through some of these actions. We hope to drive some clarity through some of these actions, because it is kind of frankly, scope 3 is a bit of a hot mess for everyone. Real talk today, I'll be honest about that. It's a very hard topic. And I think that one of the things that we're trying to do is really help through that Microsoft Sustainability Calculator that we released a few weeks ago. We're really trying to help our customers gain some of that clarity and see their way clear, see through some of the noise of how do I even think about scope 3, and actually help them to then disclose their emissions that are related to using our cloud.
That's great. Well, so just one more question for you before I turn it back over to Diego. But as a leader in this space, I'm sure that you're very frequently contacted by other companies asking for help. And I'm wondering how you kind of balance your internal efforts for Microsoft versus helping others in the space.
Well, I think we're really privileged to have some amazing partners in the NGOs and universities and consultants with whom we work. And we really, we love to, as a former climate activist, prior to being at Microsoft, I'm in this because I want everyone to be rowing in the same direction to avoid this crisis. But I think that at the end of the day, just because we're all individual humans with, our, intense schedules, we do really look to civil society. We look to NGOs and others to sort of support that. And so again, not to market this too hard, but the Transform to Net Zero Coalition, I think, is going to be a really valuable source of information for that.
Great. Thanks, Liz. Well, so Diego, I want to turn it back to you for a few minutes. And so yeah, I'm actually an ecologist by training, so I really love what you're doing. But for a lot of the people in the tech industry and engineers, sometimes I think there's somewhat of a bias against natural solutions out there. And so I'm wondering if you could just talk to the group a little bit about why forest carbon offsets or forest carbon generally, forest carbon credits are really a great climate investment.
Yes, for sure. Our company was started on the insight that we have this incredible technology that recaptures carbon from the atmosphere at a very efficient pace. That technology is called photosynthesis, and it's been working for billions of years on this planet, has helped reverse many other climate changes in the past. This is not the first time that nature has served as a buffer to rebalance the carbon on the atmosphere and rebalance climate for life to continue to thrive and evolve in this planet. So we started thinking, well, first we wanted to know what is the potential. Until a few years ago, there was not clear data about what was the potential for reforestation and what was the potential for carbon capture of forest and other type of ecosystems. Today, we know that there is about 1 billion hectares that can be restored as forests without competing with other land uses. And then there is an additional 1 billion hectares that can be regenerated or stop deforestation in these areas. All in all, there is an estimation that that regeneration could recapture 200 gigatons of carbon from the atmosphere, and that is estimated to be between 1 and 2/3 of the extra carbon that we put in the atmosphere since the Industrial Revolution. So we're talking about one of the most meaningful carbon removal opportunities that we have, and that is not to mention all the co-benefits that restoring ecosystems have for the planet, including the preservation of biodiversity, the preservation of the ecological flow of waters between different geographies and ecosystems, and sources of income and medicine and livelihood for so many people around the world, right? So our focus was, okay, we have this potential, but there's been a real question of how do we make sure that if we are going to be investing on nature climate solutions, the money goes to the right projects and the accounting works, that the carbon that is being paid for is effectively removed permanently or durably from the atmosphere. And that was questions that were difficult to answer until recently. And it requires sending people to the forest and taking sample plots. And we saw the explosion of data, with satellite companies improving their systems to capture imagery, with the advancements of LiDAR, and most importantly, the advancement of machine learning, artificial intelligence in general, but techniques for computer vision, the ability to process a lot of data on the cloud. And all this information can help us today make smarter, science-based, data-driven decisions about where to put funding for restoration and regeneration of forests and other ecosystems. So while we do believe that it's important to research and invest in other areas of what we could call artificial carbon capture, and there are really great high potential projects on those fronts, we think that nature-based solutions have to play a super important role on removing carbon and avoiding emissions.
That's great. Related to that, do you think going forward there'll be a joint marketplace where you have these basically like what Stripe did, where they say they want to purchase tons of carbon that's mineralized or otherwise removed from the atmosphere? Do you think there'll be a marketplace for, not calling it offsets necessarily, but carbon removal, basically just a marketplace for carbon that will include forests in the future?
Yes, for sure. I mean, I think that the world of carbon credits, carbon offsets, different names sometimes are used, is constantly evolving. Initially, it was aimed towards reductions of emissions of energy companies, and there were the emission trading schemes, right? But it's moving more and more towards focusing on removing carbon from the atmosphere. And yes, reducing emissions that are validated, but that are additional. Because, for example, we are seeing the rise of renewable energies that are economically viable today and maybe don't require subsidies from carbon credits. So we're going to see a shift from carbon offsets that are focused on reduction of emissions, from energy, towards reductions of emissions from deforestation and towards carbon removal. And I think that also the market is demanding more and more clarity about what is carbon removal, what is reduction of emissions, what the reduction of emissions from deforestation, for example, versus reduction of emissions from energy or methane conversion to CO2. So more clarity, more transparency will make this market more efficient. And I think that ultimately, yes, it's going to be a marketplace with a lot of different solutions, because we need all of that. We need to decarbonize the economy, and we need to remove carbon from the atmosphere.
Excellent. Well, so Will, I think have you been getting quite a few questions over there?
Yeah, we've got a handful of questions.
Okay. Yeah, I want to make sure that people get a chance to have their questions answered. So maybe we could turn it over to audience questions, and if if we need to, we can come back to mine. But I think that was very insightful. What we just heard from Liz and Diego.
Yeah, thank you both, and thanks, George, for your presentation. That was great. I mean, as I said when we were kind of warming up, this is, I think, like the single most important thing humanity is working on. So I was really excited personally to hear this talk. Quite a few questions, and I'm going to lump a couple of them together because a set of them is more for Pachama, a set is more for Microsoft. The first set for Pachama is Pachama more focused on investors or companies or individuals? And second question, unrelated, do you look into afforestation as well? It seems like your technologies would be well positioned to find good opportunities for new forests. And then, so loading up three because we don't have much time. And then a very specific question to Diego is in the VERRA registry. They have a total of 62.9 million, carbon dioxide equivalent tons over a certain time period, and from 22,000 hectares of peatland rainforest. How can I get in touch with direct VCU buyers so I can use the proceeds to work on more reforestation?
Great. First, yes, we are more focused on corporations. While we do think that individuals and consumers that do have a role to play, and we expect that people start voting with their dollars by supporting companies that are making these pledges, we decided to focus first on helping corporations, both large and small, make an impact today on their climate action. The second question about afforestation, yes, there is enormous potential for afforestation. We humans have such a ingenuity to bring about big engineering projects, and I think that we should put this ingenuity to afforestation, which is of incredible potential. We do have a few projects of afforestation in our platform, in particular some projects in Uruguay, areas that were cattle ranching lands with no trees today support millions of trees, and that is an example of the potential that we have for afforestation. And we hope to help originate more and more afforestation projects in areas with big potential. And then the final question, sure, reach out to us. My email is diego@pachama. If we can help bring good projects to market and connect the parties, that's exactly what we are about. It's about connecting the parties and bringing more transparency to these connections.
Great. I gave you a tricky set of three questions. They're pretty unrelated. You nailed them. Two to Liz. One missing component from a carbon consumption point of view is how much virtual collaboration, such as Microsoft Teams, adds. Do you have a scientific calculation to measure the carbon emissions per Teams call, per participant, per minute, that kind of thing? And then secondly, a more broad question, perhaps, with Microsoft's continued growth in cloud computing, can you talk what Microsoft is doing to help optimize data centers from a greenhouse gas emissions perspective? And what about leveraging data center infrastructure with regards to the carbon removal goals?
Great. So yes, with regard to Teams and our other product offerings, we have veritably unleashed the just innate sort of enthusiasm for sustainability from all of our engineering teams. I mean, believe it or not, our employees are perhaps it's living in the Pacific Northwest as we do, or a lot of interest in environmentalism from our employees already, even before this moment in time, and so across the board, we have some really interesting product innovations underway that account for greenhouse gas emissions in ways that we're really excited about. So stay tuned on that one. On the cloud question, we have actually announced a partnership earlier this year with Vattenfall, a utility out of Europe that pilots the use of real-time carbon accounting to help utilities and help data centers, also data center operators, manage their load based on what the cleanest time is to consume grid energy. And so when the sun is shining or when the wind is blowing versus when a coal plant is burning. We're able to then use data in that exciting way to actually do what a lot of us have dreamed of for years, which is to just choreograph supply and demand to make it cleaner, and just sometimes shift demand based on other objectives, of course, shift demand in time, within even 5-minute increments. So that's pretty awesome. And then with regard to carbon removal, could you just remind me of the nature of the question, Will?
Oh, yeah, I guess it was sort of leveraging that data center infrastructure with regards to carbon removal goals, but
right.
I think it kind of ties into what you just said.
We're very interested. I mean, just stepping back for a minute on our carbon removal commitment, we have quite a hefty carbon removal obligation now that we've set for ourselves, voluntarily, but set for ourselves between now and 2050. And so we're anticipating that we'll need to source 6 million tons of carbon dioxide removal by 2030, and then beyond that to 2050. And so one of the things we're doing now, as I mentioned before, we issued an RFP several weeks ago. It's just heads up, it's now closed. We did a quick pulse to see what's out there on the market, and we're definitely going to have future RFPs. So anyone who's interested, definitely be in touch. We're interested in building an innovative portfolio that includes both natural climate solutions, reforestation, afforestation, and as well engineered solutions such as direct air capture, BECCS, carbon mineralization. We're looking at the whole gamut. We're not picking winners or losers. We're looking at the whole gamut. And so for us, it's really exciting. Then also, once we have a really better sense of the sort of market landscape today, I really look forward to sort of taking our whether it's our campuses or our data center operations, and using them as sort of a living lab of innovation to then say, is there anything that's possible on our campus, whether it's through industrial heat or hydrogen or what have you, like just really thinking about that and putting all the great minds that work on those campuses and work on those operations, like putting them to work really creatively to think about what's possible for the future. So I think that right now it's a very early state, it's very early days for us. And I think it's just an exciting time, and we look forward to sharing what we learned from our homework.
Yeah, super cool. Okay, one last question. I know we're running a little late. Related to Scope 3 emissions and supply chain, it's kind of actually a two-part question. So how has COVID impacted companies' views of their supply chain, and what kind of sustainability obligations they're pushing down to suppliers? And then are there companies or startups that you recommend or know of that help companies access data across their supply chain?
On the first question, yeah, I mean, I think there's just an utter respect that we have for, this moment in time of the pandemic has really, I think, sort of level set how we relate to each other, both as humans and as companies. We're very deeply respectful of our suppliers and our customers, who are all going through similar things at this moment in time. Different crises in different sectors, and different challenges that the different sectors face. In terms of how that affects our actual work, so for example, our supplier code of conduct that we released this summer, we're going to actually conduct a series of listening sessions to hear how that actually will look for suppliers, and then feed that back into how we actually implement that. And so we might have done that anyway, but I think it's especially an acute need now, just given how hard the economy has been for so many sectors. And then what was the second question, Will?
Oh, and this is kind of for the others as well. Like, are there startups or others like who are measuring these things or can help other companies? Well,
I would say I'm not going to name any startups that I'm looking at, largely because I frankly haven't done my deep homework on that particular topic with regard to Scope 3. But I would say that we have a really interesting sibling program called AI for Earth, which is a program that we issued. We announced several years ago that encourages startups and nonprofits and universities to use environmental data and use advanced technologies in service of accelerating their missions. And so that Scope 3 topic falls squarely into that, in the sort of crossover of my program and that program. And so I think what Microsoft is really interested in doing is hearing from those companies that are, and hopefully encouraging them, whether through use of our cloud, our Azure cloud services, or through other partnerships, and possibly even investment through our Climate Innovation Fund. So that's not the most satisfactory answer, but I think it's really fertile ground for those types of companies.
Yeah, I can point to a few startups that are working on these areas. One of them is called Carbon Chain, focusing on helping companies with their supply chain. Another one, a company called Emitwise, Watershed, and Sinai. These are 4 startups that I know are working on helping corporations with their carbon accounting on different parts of the scopes.
Cool. Well, we're past time for Q&A. I'll hand it back to George to kind of wrap up. Thank you both.
Thanks, Will. All right, so yeah, so let's see here. Some summary points. I'll just make this very fast. Just to summarize my presentation, we're likely to see these permanent shifts with work from home and reduced business travel that have important implications for sustainability. There's a lot of reason to be optimistic because of the continued leadership from corporates, the trends that are likely to accelerate around digitalization of sustainability data, and the strengthening social movements that we're seeing that may work to reinforce each other going forward. We've heard from Liz about a range of exciting activities that Microsoft is doing as the leader in the space. And we heard from Diego about the approaches that Pachama is taking to making forest carbon available for climate action. So that was really a pleasure to hear from both of you. And I just want to say briefly that Orange Silicon Valley has a corporate co-innovation program called X-Force. So corporations increasingly today need to work together on innovation. And X-Force is a great platform for doing that. Sustainability is one of the topic areas that we cover through X-Force. And if you're interested in learning more specifically about X-Force, feel free to reach out to David Martin at Orange Silicon Valley or Ellen Crown at Orange Business Services. And lastly, I just want to give a special thanks again to our guest speakers, Liz and Diego, and to thank all of you for tuning in today. And I hope to see you at a future session. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much.